You're listening to the Intrepid radio program with Scotty Roberts. Intelligent talk.
Well, happy hump day, folks. It's Wednesday. This is Scotty Roberts. You're listening to my program, the Intrepid radio program, right here on the Odyssey Radio Network. That's ODYSY1.com. Go on over and find all the goodness that is Odyssey Radio. At the same time, you can be watching the simulcast in video and joining the live chat room during this broadcast over on my YouTube channel. That's youtube.com/Mr. Scotty Roberts. Now, all my regular listeners, you've heard that over 230 times. But that's for all you newbies out there that are new to the show. You can listen to it in audio. You can watch it in video. And the beautiful thing about watching it in video is you can also join the live chat room as we're going. So welcome tonight. We're in our ongoing series on Native America, the conquering of the American West. Now, you know me all pretty well, unless you're new to the program. You know where I stand on current events and on reparations and on things that happened in the past that we have no control over today. The West, the United States, was definitely a conquered country. We came to settle in the early 1600s, and we continued on with moving out the native peoples who lived here. Why? Because we had more firepower than they had. And we wanted that land. And eventually, in the middle of the 19th century, we decided there was a thing called manifest destiny. It was our destiny manifest by God himself. Or herself, or itself, or however you want to view God. Let's not get technical tonight. It was our manifest destiny to push westward, to take the land that was there from the inhabitants that dwelt there. Now, this is certainly, like slavery and that issue, an old paradigm. That is not something that we should be operating under now. We have, I believe, evolved as a country. Our founders, as we know, many of them owned slaves. 9 of our earliest presidents owned slaves. But at the same time as they founded this country and spoke of equality for all, for that all men, meaning all humanity, is created equal, that they struggled with this issue of slavery. It was a paradigm of its day. The entire world engaged in it. And the United States was not the only nation to engage in it, not the only nation to prosper on the backs of kidnapped, enslaved people. And so what we had with the founders were men who decidedly said this is inconsistent with who we say we are, what we offer the world, and they eventually abolished slavery. About 90 years later, it took almost a century for us to do that, from the founding of the nation to the freeing of the slaves. And even the freeing of the slaves was meant to be an economic pressure point on the South to help end the Civil War. And there was something, by the way, about the Civil War that somebody said earlier this morning on a post of mine on Facebook. They were talking about how those were all rebels. We shouldn't honor them with statuary because they were all traitors to the United States. And while that in and of itself is true, the one historical point they are forgetting is that all the traitors, the rebels, the Confederacy, fighting against the Union of the United States after the war were all repatriated. as Ulysses S. Grant said, and we've mentioned this before, as at Appomattox Courthouse, in the residence where they signed the surrender, the South surrendered to the North, to the Union, and Ulysses S. Grant accepted the sword of Robert E. Lee and his signature on the papers of surrender. The war came to an end, and Ulysses S. Grant and Robert E. Lee walked out together onto the porch of that house. The Union soldiers were lined up all along the road coming out of the house, the road which is now the Lynchburg Road. It was the Lynchburg Road back then. It's now a highway that you can take to Lynchburg. They routed the highway around this small village that's still there. And Robert E. Lee mounted up, and he led all his Confederate soldiers out, and they started marching down the Lynchburg Road. And all the Union soldiers were jeering them, booing them, hissing at them, catcalling at them. And Robert E. Lee rode out with his head high, a bit in shame. They're surrendered, and his troops followed behind him, putting up with this mockery that was going on. And Ulysses S. Grant, from the porch of the house, called out to his men to be silent. He said, "You'll be silent." He wasn't happy with them at all. And he made the famous statement, amongst other things that he said at that moment, but he said, "The rebels are again our countrymen." And that's the way they viewed it back then. There was a civil war, and the rebels who were fighting for their cause are now repatriated. Now, the same could be said for what's going on nowadays. Are the people that in Seattle and so on. I don't even want to get into that. I'm starting to get into an issue. There's a question there. Should those people be repatriated? They're definitely traitors to the country. They want to clothe it in the garb of revolution. And even Thomas Jefferson said, for this republic to survive, there needs to be a little revolution every 20 years or so. That's a little revolution. It's people up in arms. But the big question is, do they know what they're talking about? Is their revolution a justifiable one? Is the means that they're doing it justifiable? Is it really a revolution, or is it just an uprising? This is all yet to be seen. So I'm going to rabbit trail onto that issue, and I don't want to do that. The only point I am making now is that our country, what it is now, is not what it was 100 years ago, not what it was 100 years before that. It's evolving in its concepts. The founders were pure genius futurists who understood that the following generations would be implementing all of this. They were at their inception back then. They couldn't implement everything, boom, right then and there. They would have crumbled in 10 years. But what they did was found a nation that would evolve. And this is what we've seen happen. And so, bringing that all, let's tie that knot and bring it all into the topic we're talking about the conquest of the American West. It's a shameful thing that they did. A lot of atrocities were committed in the name of manifest destiny, in the name of that flag behind me. There it is. It's over there. And you can see it. By the way, that's a flag my dad sent me. That's a brand new flag I put up there just earlier this morning. So replacing the old one. And so they did these things in the name of the United States. It's not something we would do now. We've evolved beyond that. How would we handle this continent now under those same circumstances? I don't know. That's for speculation. But history says that we did one thing, and it was a series of atrocities that took the native peoples who lived there and stripped them of their identity, stripped them of their land, stripped them of all they had, and tried to assimilate them into the United States. Now, you Star Trek fans, it's kind of like the Borg. You will be assimilated, or you will die. And that's what happened. Now, we were starting this little series to go through some of the events of certain tribes, certain things that took place that might not be common history. I am using for a lot of my material an alternate history of the United States, and that is the history that was written by D. Brown in his book Bury My Heart at Wounded Knee, where he goes and gives the Native American perspective as to what happened in the conquering of the American West. It was not the winning of the West, as we like to whitewash it. It was the conquering and the subjugation of the American West, and we claimed it for ourselves. Now, can we change what happened in the past? No. As atrocious as some of the actions were, as unjust as it was, we can't change it. We are in the here and the now. I was born in 1960, which was about 100 years, 95 years after a lot of these things we're going to talk about even tonight took place. Barely a century. And we live in a country that has moved beyond that, but now what do? We have all these treaties that were written with these native peoples, and we've seen them dismantled one by one by one after the other. I had mentioned some time ago, talking about with family members of mine, they were in-laws, my ex-wife, many years ago, I'm talking 25 years ago. And we live in the state of Minnesota, and they were all avid anglers, fishermen, loved to fish. And they were complaining about the Minnewakanton Sioux up on Lake Mille Lacs, I believe it's the Minnewakanton, that were spearfishing. They were spearfishing by a century-old treaty right that was written in the treaty. It said, in perpetuity, meaning from this time and forever, as long as you are alive and as long as the United States stands, this treaty and the rights that are in this treaty are yours, and they cannot be rescinded. Well, what happened up there on Lake Mille Lacs? They tried to rescind the treaty rights because they said the Native Americans were taking too many fish, and it was hurting the tourism business in the summer up there. There were no fish to catch, they said. Native Americans said, we're being responsible, and we're not taking any more than our daily limit set by the treaty. But the state of Minnesota and others were working very hard to rescind their treaty rights for fish, for tourism. And so you can see what these people have suffered, the injustices along the way. And I do believe the Native Americans won that case. It was fought for many years. It still goes on even now to different degrees. So this is what you're seeing, is that it was a people that was subjugated, a people enslaved, a people imprisoned. We saw last night how the Navajo were pushed onto the Bosque Redondo, a worthless piece of land that, unbeknownst to them at the time, because we didn't know uranium at the time, at least it wasn't used the way we do now, the uranium was spoiling the land under the Bosque Redondo and spoiling the water, and the people were getting sick, the people were dying. There was probably what we call now radon poisoning going on. So all of that happened. The big question that we're left with today is, what do we do in the now? I think the first thing we do is understand the history. And next, we realize that we can all work together. We live together, and I hate the phrase because it's so maligned and it's so misused for political agendas, but we are all in this together. We are all citizens of the United States, even though the Indians have kind of a dual citizenship, is that they're citizens of their own sovereign lands in the reservation. And they fall under federal jurisdiction. And so what do we do now? We do our best to work together. None of us were there when it happened. None of us imposed it. None of us were the victims of it. But today, those reservations still exist, many of them in poor conditions. And so it is incumbent upon us to work together as all citizens of this country. And if you see that there are injustices in the past, and you will through this series, It's painful. Some of it is very painful to read. I am very impassioned by these issues. And sometimes when I'm going through this presentation, I'm giving it to you. A couple of times last night, it was all I could do to not have my passion of the issue overrun my emotions. That's just the way I am. I don't mean to wear it on my sleeve, but sometimes it's there. So I want to take you through some events tonight and show you more of this. I think it is good, and we're going to do this for many days to come. I think it is very good for us to know these things. This is the hidden history, the missing history that we're not taught in schools. Hopefully, more and more as we evolve. I think there could be, and there probably are, whole college courses or high school elective courses that focus on Native American history and their view of what happened in the West as the natives were driven westward. And then we started going past them out to the West Coast and pushing from that direction as well. We squeezed them all into the middle of the country and wiped them out. So, without further commentary on that, I want to get into more of this history. And we're talking about, tonight, we're going to start talking about Little Crow's War. And this is about 1,000 miles north of the Navajo country. And it was at the same time as the stuff we were talking about last night, the mid-1860s. And it was at this same time of the white man's great civil war that the Santee Sioux were losing their homeland forever. The Santee were of 4 divisions: the Mdewakanton, the Wahpetons, the Wapakutes, and the Sissetons. And they were woodland Sioux, but they kept close ties and shared a strong tribal pride with their blood brothers of the prairies, the Yanktons and the Tetons. The Santee were the people of the farther end, quote-unquote, people of the farther end. And they were the frontier guardians of the Sioux domain. And during the 10 years preceding the Civil War, more than 150,000 white settlers pushed into Santee country, and it collapsed the left flank of the once permanent Indian frontier. And as a result of 2 deceptive treaties, the woodland Sioux surrendered 90% of their land. They were tricked through treaty, and they were crowded into a narrow strip of territory along the Minnesota River. And from the beginning, agents and traders had hovered around them like buzzards around carcasses of slaughtered buffalo, systematically cheating them out of the greater part of the promised annuities for which they'd been persuaded to give up their lands. You give up your lands, we're gonna give you all of this. And there were unscrupulous traders that weaseled and what's the word I'm looking for? Not weasel. Swindled them out of their treaty rights. Many of the white men often abused the Indians and treated them unkindly, Big Eagle said. Perhaps they had excuse, but the Indians didn't think so. Many of the whites always seemed to say by their manner when they saw an Indian, "I'm better than you." And the Indians didn't like this. There was excuse for this, but the Dakota, the Sioux, did not believe there were better men in the world than they. Then some of the white men abused the Indian women in a certain way that disgraced them, and surely there was no excuse for that. All these things made many Indians dislike the whites. It wasn't just the pushing into their land and stealing their land and taking it from them. It's the atrocities they committed to the individuals, by individuals. So in the summer of 1862, everything seemed to go badly between the Santee and the white men. Most of the wild game was gone from the reservation land. Remember, they'd been pushed onto the Minnesota River Valley. And by the way, you can see that in Minnesota today. You drive from Wisconsin over to, say, the airport, 35, 40-minute drive from my house. And there's one stretch where you have to cross all the wetlands on the big bridges. And it's the forested wetlands that are all the Minnesota River Valley that run for miles in either direction, north and south. And so this was their land, and extended a bit further than that, but that was the core of their land from the Minnesota River going west. And when Indians crossed into their old hunting grounds, now claimed by white settlers west of the Minnesota River Valley, there was often trouble. For the second year running, the Indians' crop yields were poor, and many of them had to go to the agency traders to get their food on credit. And the Santee had learned to hate the credit system because they had no control over the accounts. When their annuities came from Washington, the traders held first claim on the money, and whatever amount the traders claimed in their accounts, the government agents would pay them. And so some of the Santee had learned to keep accounts, and all their records might be less by many dollars than the traders' accounts. The government agents would not accept them. They wanted their own record, the government traders. And Ta'oya Te Dutta, Little Crow, Ta'oya Te Dutta, Little Crow, became very angry with the traders the summer of 1862. Now, you remember me talking about Fort Snelling up here. It's right in the Minneapolis area. Fort built around 1800. And I talked about the concentration camp there that was put up after the Dakota War in 1862. Now you're going to start to see some correlation with things we've shared with you, both in event and paranormal realms, things that we've done. And so in the summer of 1862, Little Crow was a chief of the Mdewakanton, as had been his father and his grandfather before him. He was 60 years old. He was the age I am now, only probably much more vital. Outdoorsman, been in a lot of battle, tough guy. He was 60 and always wore long-sleeve garments to cover his lower arms and his wrists, which were withered as a result of bad-healed wounds received in battle during his youth. And Little Crow had signed both the treaties that tricked his people out of their land and the money promised for the land. He'd been to Washington to see the Great Father, President Buchanan, and he'd exchanged his breechclouts and blankets for trousers and brass-button jackets. He had joined the Episcopal Church, built a house, started a farm. But during the summer of 1862, Little Crow's disillusionment was turning to anger, as you can well imagine. In July, several thousand Santee assembled at the upper agency on Yellow Medicine River to collect their annuities, which were pledged by the treaties, so that they might exchange them for food. The money didn't arrive, and there were rumors that the Great Council, what they called Congress, in Washington, D.C., had expended all their gold fighting the Great Civil War and could not send money to the Indians. Because their people were starving, Little Crow and some of the other chiefs went to their agent, Thomas Galbraith, and he asked why they could not be issued food from the agency warehouse, which was filled with provisions. Galbraith replied that he couldn't do this until the money arrived. Then he brought up 100 soldiers to guard the warehouse. It's just a warehouse full of supplies. You got the Santee who need food, need blankets, need supplies. And the Indian agent, Galbraith, is withholding them because there's no money from the government to pay him for them. Now, I understand the business side of that. I don't understand letting people starve because you're not getting your money. Wouldn't have come out of his pocket. He just wouldn't have earned anything off of it. Not right away, anyway. So on August 4th, 500 Santee surrounded the soldiers while others broke into the warehouse and began carrying out sacks of flour. The white soldier chief, Timothy Sheehan, sympathized with the Santee, and instead of firing upon them, he persuaded Galbraith to issue pork and flour to the Indians and await payment until the money arrived. Good for the good people in the midst of all of this. We got to end there for this first half, but we'll be right back after a couple of minutes. Sit tight. More to come.
Are you looking for a really awesome and amazing graphic designer? How about an illustrator or a photographer? This is Rainey Roberts, and I wanted to tell you how you can get my designer, illustrator husband, Scotty Roberts, to work for you on your project. Do you have an awesome self-published book but no cover, or even worse, a cover that really sucks? Do you need a kick-ass logo for your company or some f***ing awesome graphic designs for your ads or website? Then get in touch with my husband for the best f***ing awesome kick-ass design and illustration. He knows his stuff, and he's been at this for more years than I've been alive. Go to ScottAllenRoberts.com. That's Scott with 2 T's, ALANROBERTS.com to take a look at his online portfolio of work, or call 651-468-8115. Now go out and kick some ass with some kick-ass graphic design.
Hire my dad so he can take me to Disneyland.
All right, folks, we're back. Thanks for sitting on through the break. This is Scotty Roberts. You're listening to the Intrepid radio program right here on the Odyssey Radio Network. That's ODYSY1.com. And then come on over to my YouTube channel where you can watch the simulcast of this broadcast in video and the live chat room as the show is being broadcast. It's going on right now. Come on over and join the other Intrepids and have a good time over there. Let's pick up right away where we left off because there's a lot of material here. We were talking about Little Crow and how the agency, the Indian agency with Galbraith, the Indian agent, was holding back the supplies because the money had not come from D.C. to pay for them yet. This was the treaty rights of the Indians. They were to receive money and then pay Galbraith for the supplies in his warehouse. They were starving. There was nothing to eat. They needed clothing, they needed blankets, and it was being withheld. And there was, he even called in 100 troops to surround the warehouse to protect it. And so that the Indians wouldn't come in and take anything. He didn't want any trouble, but he's bringing in soldiers. And Timothy Sheehan, he was the head of the soldiers, sympathized with the Santee and said, look, and the Santee had come, by the way, with 500 of them, surrounded the warehouse and said, give us food. When the money comes in, take our money. We just need food and clothes. And so instead of firing on him, he persuaded Galbraith, the agent, to issue the pork and the flour to the Indians and await payment until the money arrived. Let Galbraith, one guy, live off of the credit of the government as opposed to all of the Santee who needed the food. And so after Galbraith released the food, the Santee went away peacefully. Little Crow didn't leave, however, until the agent promised to issue similar amounts of food to the Santee at the lower agency, 30 miles downriver at Redwood, Minnesota, today. And although Little Crow's village was near the lower agency, Galbraith kept him waiting several days before arranging a council at Redwood for August 15th of that year, 1862. Early that morning, Little Crow and several hundred hungry Mdewankatons assembled, but it was obvious from the beginning that Galbraith and the 4 traders at the lower agency had absolutely no intention of issuing more food from their stores before the arrival of the annuity funds from D.C. Angered by yet another broken promise, Little Crow arose, faced Galbraith, and spoke for his people. He said, this is a quote, "We have waited a long time. The money is ours, but we cannot get it. We have no food, but here are these stores filled with food. We ask that you, our agent, make some arrangement by which we can get food from the stores, or else we may have to take our own way to keep ourselves from starving. When men are hungry, they help themselves." This is what Little Crow said to Galbraith. Instead of replying, Galbraith turned to the traders and asked them what they would do. Trader Andrew Myrick declared contemptuously, "So far as I am concerned, if they're hungry, let them eat grass or their own shit." Seriously? For a moment, the circle of Indians was pretty silent. I think they were stunned by what they just heard. Like, seriously? You just said that? Then came an outburst of angry shouts, and as one man of the Santee arose and left the council, the words of Andrew Myrick angered all the Santee, but to Little Crow they were like hot blasts upon his already seared emotions. He'd already lost his land. He was already dressing like the whites because they persuaded him to do so. He was already a member of the Christian church, the Episcopal Church. He already built a house. He already did some farming. But by treaty, they were supposed to help them. For years, Little Crow had tried to keep the treaties, to follow the advice of the white men and to lead his people on their road. And it seemed now that he'd lost everything. This is the recurring theme you're going to hear over all these accounts. They lost everything. They couldn't even hunt by right. This is what he meant. If you don't give us the food, we're going to have to break the treaty and go hunting. And now the agents and the traders had turned against him. His own people were losing faith in him and blaming him, Little Crow, for their misfortunes. The agency wasn't helping any. Earlier that summer, the lower agency Mdewankatons had accused Little Crow of betraying them when he signed their lands away by treaty. And they had elected, he did this to maintain the peace and to not have his people slaughtered. They had elected Traveling Hale to be their speaker in the place of Little Crow. So if Little Crow could have persuaded the agent Galbraith and the traders to give his people food, they would have respected him again, but he'd failed. So they put somebody else in his place. Traveling Rain was the guy's name. Traveling Hale, I'm sorry. And in the old days, he would have just regained leadership by going to war. But the treaties pledged him to not engage in hostilities with either the white men or other tribes. This is what he signed away by treaty. He said, "I will not do this. I will not go to war." Why was it, he wondered, that the Americans talked so much of peace between themselves and the Indians, and between Indians and Indians, and yet they themselves waged such a savage war with the Graycoats that they had no money left to pay their small debt to the Santee? This was a debt. This was a treaty made by the United States government with the Santee. And he knew that some of the young men in his band were talking openly of war with the white men. What usually starts wars, by the way, on an international scale? Disagreements, breaking of treaties, things like that. They were he knew that some of the young men in his band were talking about going to war with the white man. and a war to drive them all out, all the whites out of the Minnesota Valley. And it was a good time to fight the whites, they said, because so many blue-coat soldiers were away fighting the gray-coats. It's the Civil War's going on. And they were everywhere, the whites, like locusts, and destroyed their enemies with great thundering cannon. War upon the white men was really an unthinkable proposition. Remember, they outgunned, they had stronger weaponry and armies than the Native Americans did. And so on Sunday, August 17th, Little Crow attended the Episcopal Church at the Lower Agency, and he listened to a sermon delivered by the Reverend Samuel Hinman. At the conclusion of services, he shook hands with the other worshipers. He returned to his house, which was 2 miles upriver from the agency. Late that night, Little Crow was awakened by the sound of many voices and the noisy entry of several Santee into his sleeping room. He recognized the voice of Shakopee. And by the way, Shakopee is one of the towns in Minnesota in this area. That's where we had the Renaissance Festival that I was part of for so many years. It was for 40 years down in Shakopee, Minnesota. So something very important, something very bad had happened. Shakopee, Mankato, Mankato, Minnesota State University. Mankato State is in Mankato. So Shakopee, Mankato, Medicine Bottle, and Big Eagle had all come, and they said Wabasha would soon arrive for a council. By the way, there's a lot of towns in Minnesota named after all these guys. 4 young men of Shakopee's band, who were hungry for food, had crossed the river that sunny afternoon and to hunt. They went to go hunting. There's no food. We're going hunting. They went to hunt in the Big Woods, capital B, capital W, Big Woods. And something very bad had happened there. Big Eagle told about it. He said, and this is a quote, they came to a settler, and by the way, these guys all wrote their accounts later. That's why we have these quotes. They came to a settler's fence, and here they found a hen's nest with some eggs in it. One of them took the eggs when another said, don't take them, for they belong to a white man and we might get into trouble for stealing his eggs. The other was angry, for he was very hungry and wanted to eat the eggs, and he dashed them to the ground and replied, you're a coward. You are afraid of the white man. You are afraid to take even an egg from him, though you are half-starved. Yes, you're a coward, and I will tell everybody so. The other replied, I am not a coward. I'm not afraid of the white man, and to show you that I'm not, I'll go into that house and shoot him. Are you brave enough to go with me? And the one who had called him a coward said, yes, I'll go with you, and we'll see who's the braver of us two. Now, mind you, they have been pushed to this point. Their 2 companions then said, we'll go with you, we'll be brave too. They all went to the house of the white man, but he got alarmed and went to another house where there were some other white men and women. The 4 Indians followed them and killed 3 men and 2 women. Then they hitched up a team belonging to another settler and drove to Shakopee's camp and told them what they'd done. Now, you don't blame them, but at the same time, they are responsible for their actions. But now their actions are also putting their entire tribe into jeopardy. On hearing of the murders of the white people, Little Crow rebuked the 4 men. And then they sarcastically asked Shakopee and the others why they had come to him for advice when they had chosen Traveling Hale to be their spokesman. Why are we coming to Little Crow? And the leaders assured Little Crow that he was still their war chief. No Santee's life would be safe now after these killings, they said. It was the white man's way to punish all Indians for the crimes of 1 or 2, or the few. And the Santees might as well strike fire first instead of waiting for the soldiers to come and kill them. And it would be better to fight the white man now while they were fighting among themselves far to the south. Civil War. And you can see their logic in this. They believed if we just sit here still and wait for justice for the guys who did this, we're going to all be killed. And by the way, you look to Nazi Germany and other totalitarian regimes, they used the same kind of tactic. If somebody did something wrong, they would murder 100 people for every Nazi killed during occupation. Things like that. It's terrorism to keep the people in check. So Little Crow rejected their arguments. The white men were too powerful, he said. Yet he admitted the settlers could exact bitter vengeance because women had been killed. Little Crow's son, who was present, said later that his father's face grew haggard, and great beads of sweat stood out on his forehead. At last one of the young braves cried out, "To'oya de Tuta, Little Crow, is a coward!" He yelled out. Coward was the word that had started the killings. The challenge to the young boy who was afraid to take the white man's eggs, even when he was starving, coward, was not a word that the Sioux chief would take lightly, even though he was halfway on the white man's road. Little Crow's replied, as remembered by his young son, "Taoya Teduta is not a coward, and he is not a fool. When did he run away from his enemies, ever? When did he leave his braves behind him on the warpath and turn back to his teepee? When he ran away from your enemies, he walked behind on your trail with his face to the Ojibways and covered your backs as a she-bear covers her cubs. Is Taoya de Tuta without scalps? Look at his war feathers. Behold the scalp locks of your enemies hanging there on his lodge poles. Do you call him a coward? Taoya de Tuta is not a coward, and he is no fool. Braves, you are like little children. You don't know what you're doing. You're full of the white man's devil water. You're like dogs in the hot moon when they run mad and snap at their own shadows. We are only little herds of buffalo left scattered. The great herds that once covered the prairies are no more. See? The white men are like locusts when they fly so thick that the whole sky is a snowstorm. You may kill 1, 2, 10, yes, as many as the leaves in the forest yonder, and their brothers will not miss them. Kill 1, 2, 10, 10 times 10 will come to kill you. Count your fingers all day long, and white men with guns in their hands will come faster than you can count. Yes, they fight among themselves, a way off. Do you not hear the thunder of their big guns? No. It would take you 2 moons to run to where they're fighting, and all the way your path would be among white soldiers as thick as tamaracks in the swamps of the Ojibwe. Yes, they fight among themselves, but if you strike at them, they will all turn on you and devour you and your women and little children, just as the locusts in their time fall on the trees and devour all the leaves in one day. You are fools. You cannot see the face of your chief. Your eyes are full of smoke. You cannot hear his voice. Your ears are full of roaring waters. Braves, you are little children. You are fools. You will die like the rabbits when the hungry wolves hunt them in the hard moon of January. Taoya de Tuta is not a coward. He will die with you. He knew this. Big Eagle then spoke for peace, but he was shouted down. 10 years of abuse by white men, the broken treaties, the lost hunting grounds, the unkept promises, the undelivered annuities, their hunger for food, while the agency warehouses overflowed with it, the insulting words of Andrew Myrick, they all rose up to put the murders of the white settlers into the background. Little Crow sent messengers upstream to summon the Wapetans and the Sissetons to join in the war. The women were awakened and began to run bullets while the warriors cleaned their guns. Little Crow gave orders to attack the agency early next morning and to kill all the traitors, Big Eagle said afterward. The next morning when the force started to attack the agency, I went along. This is Big Eagle talking. I did not lead my band, and I took no part in the killing. I went to save the lives. Excuse me. Guys, I know I've said it a million times. I don't have a mute button in this program, so pardon me while I take a little drink. Dry throat. Big Eagle said he went along. He took no part in the killing. He said, I went to save the lives of 2 particular friends if I could. I think others went for the same reason, for nearly every Indian did not care about anybody else's friend. The killing was nearly all done when I got there. Little Crow was on the ground, directing operations. Mr. Andrew Myrick, a trader with an Indian wife, had refused some hungry Indians credit a short time before when they asked him for provisions. He said to them, go and eat grass. Now he was lying on the ground dead, with his mouth stuffed full of grass. And the Indians were saying tauntingly, Myrick is eating grass himself. Think he didn't deserve that? That's one of those moments of poetic justice. But still. And here's Little Crow at the middle of all this. He's leading them. He said, I'm your chief, I'll lead you, but this will lead to our death. So the Santees killed 20 men, captured 10 women and children, emptied the warehouses of provisions, and set the other buildings afire. The remaining 47 inhabitants, some of whom were aided in their escapes by friendly Santee, fled across the river to Fort Ridgely, 13 miles downstream. Boy, I got a tickle in my throat, guys. Sorry. On the way to Fort Ridgely, the survivors met a company of 45 soldiers marching to the aid of the agency. The Reverend Hinman, who had the previous day preached the last sermon ever heard by Little Crow, warned the soldiers to turn back. The soldier chief, John Marsh, refused to heed the warning and marched into a Santee ambush. Only 24 of his men out of the 47 escaped alive to make their way back to the fort. Encouraged by his first successes, Little Crow decided to attack the soldiers' house itself, Fort Ridgely. Wabasha and his band had arrived. Mankato's force had been increased by more warriors. Fresh allies were reported on their way from the upper agency, and Big Eagle could no longer remain neutral while his people were at war. And by the way, there is no comparison that could be used by the people rioting today in our current times. I've seen people try. They try to compare themselves to the American Revolution, to the Tea Party. That's why we talked about the Boston Tea Party a few weeks ago. They try to compare themselves to the Native Americans. There is no comparison. It's not the same. It is a false equivalency. And you just look at the details and you'll see why. So during the night, these chiefs and their several hundred warriors moved down the Minnesota Valley, and early on the morning of August 19th, they began assembling on the prairie west of the fort. The young men were all anxious to go, said Lightning Blanket, one of the participants, and we dressed as warriors in war paint, breech clout, and leggings, with a large sash around us to keep our food and ammunition in. When some of the untried young men saw the sturdy stone buildings of the soldier's house and the armed bluecoats waiting there, they had second thoughts about attacking the place. And on the way down from the lower agency, they talked of how easy it would be to raid the village on the Cottonwood, New Ulm, Minnesota. The town across the river was filled with stores to be looted, and no soldiers were there. Why could they not just do their fighting at New Ulm? Little Crow told them that Santees were at war, and to be victorious they must defeat the Bluecoat soldiers, not just settlers. If they could drive the soldiers from the valley, then all the white settlers would go away. The Santee would gain nothing by killing a few white people at New Ulm. This was his way of saying, we're at war. Don't hurt innocent settlers, even though we disagree with what they're doing. You fight the battle with the soldiers. I would like to see the citizens, quote-unquote, of CHOP, or Chaz, whatever you want to call it up in Seattle, go head-to-head with the United States Army. It'd be a different proposition, wouldn't it? Same kind of thing there. Comparison. That's about the only comparison you could make. But in spite of Little Crow's warnings, his scoldings, his entreaties, the young men began to drift away toward the river. Little Crow consulted with the other chiefs, and they decided to delay the assault on Fort Ridgely until the next day. Fort Ridgely, pretty strong place, built out of stone, so a lot of these warriors turned away to cross the river and go attack the civilians. That evening, the young men returned from New Ulm. They had frightened the people there, they said, but the town was too strongly defended, and besides, a bad lightning storm had come out of the sky in the afternoon. So Big Eagle called them marauding Indians without a chief to lead them, and that night they all agreed to stay together and attack Fort Ridgely the following morning. We started at sunrise, Lightning Blanket said. We crossed the river at the agency on the ferry, followed the road to the top of the hill below Faribault's Creek, where we stopped for a short rest. There the plans for attacking the fort were given out by Little Crow. He said after reaching the fort, the signal 3 volleys was to be given by Medicine Bottle's men to draw the attention and fire of the soldiers. So the men on the east, Big Eagles, and those on the west and south, Little Crows and Shakopees, would rush in and take the fort. We reached the 3 Mile Creek before noon and cooked something to eat. After eating, we separated, I going with the footmen to the north, and after leaving Little Crow, we paid no attention to the chiefs. Everyone did as he pleased. Both parties reached the fort about the same time as we could. We could see them passing to the west, Little Crow on a black pony. The signal 3 shots was given by our side, Medicine Bottle's men. After the signal, the men on the east, south, and the west were slowly coming up. And by the way, this is a written account by Big Eagle. As we were running in, we saw the man with the big guns, whom we all knew. And as we were the only ones in sight, he shot into us, as he'd gotten ready after hearing the shooting in our direction. Had Little Crow's men fired after we fired the signal, the soldiers who shot us probably would have been killed. 2 of our men were killed and 3 hurt, 2 dying afterward. We ran back into the creek and did not know whether the other men would come up close or not, but they did, and the big guns drove them back from that direction. If we had only known that they would come up close, we could have shot them at the same time and killed all, as the soldiers were out in the big opening between the buildings. We did not fight like white men with 1 officer. We all shot as we pleased. The plan of rushing into the buildings was given up, and we shot at the windows, mostly at the big stone building, as we thought many of the whites were in there. We couldn't see them, so we're not sure we were killing any. During the shooting, we tried to set fire to the buildings with fire arrows, but the buildings would not burn. So we had to get more powder and bullets. The sun was about 2 hours high when we went around to the west of the fort and decided to go back to Little Crow's village and come up and keep the fighting the next day. For the next day. There were about 400 Indians in this attack. No women were along. They all stayed at Little Crow's village. The cooking was done by boys 10 to 15 years of age who were too young to fight. And this is Big Eagle's account of what was going on that day. And I hate to say it, but we're out of time. There's a whole lot more to this war, which was dubbed later the Dakota War, and we're going to cover that tomorrow, so you can see what these people were driven to. Starvation, stealing of their land, stealing of everything they had nothing. And they were dependent on the treaties that the U.S. government had written, and the U.S. government failed them. And they're driven to this point. They started committing atrocities of their own against citizens, but you can see why they ended up where they were. More to this story, and we'll conclude it tomorrow. So thanks for being here. Have a good night. 23-hour break. We'll be right back. Sit tight.